Good morning, everyone. This is Doug. We're going to do an episode. It's our third in a series on what could the mark of the beast possibly be? What is it? And we have another indication what it is. And I think this is actually more biblical than a lot of others. And this comes from Dr. Eli Lazorkin Eisenberg. And he's going to compare the words, the mark of the beast in Revelation 13:16, which talks about these are going to be put on your wrist or your forehead. And that happens to also be the place where the law otherwise was to be in Deuteronomy 6, verse 8, as you'll see. And people actually would keep copies of little portions of the law written on a piece of paper and wrapped around their wrist, or they might put it in a little box underneath their lock of hair that would hang right over the middle of their forehead. So this was the same places that the mark of the beast is going to go. All right, so let's take a look at the comparison that this gentleman is making. So he's saying, let's compare. First, let's look at this, and then we'll read Revelation 13:16. You'll see how they compare. Deuteronomy verses 6 to 7 to 8. And thou shalt teach them diligently the commandments unto thy children, and shalt talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. Verse 8, and thou shalt bind them for a sign upon your hand, they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. So a sign means something to indicate externally what others should know what your focus is, what your life is about. Your life is about obeying God's commandments. And so that may be, that's what this professor is going to say, this doctor, he's going to say that's the same thing that the beast's system is going to make it be, that by this identification somehow on your hand, wrist, it's going to identify what system you belong to just by the way it looks, or we'll see what it really is. I have a theory. Now let's listen to one of the commentaries on this. I think it's useful. It gives us a bigger, broader context. Deuteronomy 6, verse 8. Thou shalt bind them for a sign upon your hand. As at that time there were few written copies of the whole law, and the people had it read to them only at the Feast of Tabernacles. God seems to have appointed, at least for the present, that some select sentences of the law that were most weighty and comprehensive should literally be written upon their gates and walls, or on slips of parchment to be worn about their wrists or bound upon their foreheads. The spirit of the command, however, and the chief thing intended undoubtedly was that they should give all diligence and use all means to keep God's laws always in remembrance, as men frequently bind something upon their hands or put something before their eyes to prevent the forgetfulness of a thing which they must much desire to remember. All right, now I just want to pause here and go back to verse 8 of Deuteronomy 6. You shall bind them, these words, on pieces of paper for a sign upon your hand. Okay, sign. And it shall be as frontlets. So these indicators are a sign of who you belong to. And I just want to show you something later. Exodus 31, verse 12 states that God gave the Sabbath as a sign between himself and Israel. So that's something external. It can be seen. So I believe you can say that the sign of Sabbath is also a symbol of the very same thing that you're reading in Deuteronomy 6, verse 8 about a sign. The frontlets of your head or your wrist will have these words of God about the commandments to obey. And now we also see the Sabbath is a way of exemplifying and showing people what you are all about. You will congregate and you will rest and worship on that day of Shabbat. Okay, just throwing that out there before I give you all the other commentaries to follow. Now, I want to be clear, Eli Lazorkin does not agree with that. He doesn't say he agrees or agrees that I'm correct or disagrees that I'm wrong. He doesn't say either thing. He just simply points out that there's a commonality between the beast mark and the original mark that would signify who you are, what your background is, and what you believe in by having these frontlets or these wrist identifiers of what you believe in. Okay, so I want to show you what his words are about himself. Dr. Lazorkin Eisenberg has received a fair amount of Jewish and Christian education, both religious and secular. One of his great passions is building bridges of trust, respect, and understanding between Christians and Jews, overcoming centuries of difficult but almost always joined history. Dr. Eli Lazorkin Eisenberg strongly believes that both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament scriptures have much to teach both communities. He resides at Israel with his wife and children. His education is fairly impressive. Take a look at this. Dr. Eli Lazorkin Eisenberg holds a Master of Divinity degree in theology from the Reformed Theological Seminary 2000. So that means he's in the Calvinist School of Reformation Studies. He has a Master of Philosophy degree in Bible Interpretation, 2008, from Stellenbosch University. He holds a PhD in Ancient Cultures from Stellenbosch University, 2011. Additional studies include doctoral and postdoctoral studies at the University of Pennsylvania, Leiden University, Princeton Theological Seminary, and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. All right, so here's the email I received March 15, 2024. Mark of the Beast. When interpreters consult the pages of Scripture rather than front page news, the biblical connotation of the mark becomes clearer. Mark of the Beast. Revelation describes the mark being placed on, quote, the right hand or the forehead, Revelation 13, verse 16, which echoes the description of God's commandments in the Torah. Quote, you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. That means on your forehead. Deuteronomy 6, verse 8, compare Deuteronomy 11, verse 18. Based on this verse, later Jews affixed Tefillin, small boxes containing biblical text. Now, that's not mandatory, okay, that you use a box, but that's what they did later, to their hands and foreheads. In the Greek New Testament, Tefillin are called phylacteries. Matthew 23, verse 5. And observant Jews wear these ritual adornments during prayer to this day. Thus, from a Jewish perspective, it is immediately clear that the mark of the beast takes the place of the divine commands. So, in other words, it requires you to reject the divine commands, is what he says as he goes on. Now, I'm going to jump out of that email to go into his book where he says this is all going to be expounded upon further. And his book is called Hebrew Insights from Revelation. It's $9.99 at Kindle. I don't get any referral fees. I'm just telling you it's a good book to read. He's very in-depth about things. And it has 4.5 stars on 791 ratings, and that's pretty darn good. Now, let's continue. Here's where I'm going to pick up in that book. So this is page 19 of this book, Hebrew Insights from Revelation by Dr. Lazarkin. And then he's talking about their right hand or on their forehead. So that's the mark of the beast. And that's in Revelation 13, verse 16. And then we'll skip over some of that. And it says, the mark of the beast, whatever form or shape it was to take, was to be placed on the head and on the hand, according to Revelation. To a Jewish audience, such placement sounds very familiar and would make perfect symbolic sense. In one of the passages recited daily by Jews devotionally since antiquity, Israelites were commanded to place God's words on themselves, quote, to bind them as a sign on your hand, and, quote, wear them as frontals on your forehead between the eyes. Deuteronomy 6, verse 8. In the Jewish community, these verses are practiced by wearing phylacteries or tefillin during the morning prayer. Tefillin is a set of 2 small boxes containing portion of Torah text, which are placed on the head and arm and attached with leather straps. One literally wears, I think it means it says, one literally wears God's words and makes God's ways a tangible part of his life. The mark of the beast is analogical to Tefillin. This mark would also be a sign of loyalty, but not to God of Israel and his Torah, but rather to the beast and his ways. So the mark of the beast is a way of saying, I identify with somebody who's opposed to God's Torah, who disregards the Torah. It's a tutor, whatever reason they don't want to follow it. That's the mark of the beast that identifies you that way. So I'm going to ask you, what sign do you think most indicates you are not following God Yahweh's laws? And we'll get into that in a minute. But God already tells us something that's an external action that can identify as a sign of who you serve and where you're coming from in terms of God of the Bible. In Exodus, so I put in the question to Google. I said, did God say Sabbath was a sign between himself and the people of Israel? And it says, yes. In Exodus 31, verses 12 to 18, it states that God gave the Sabbath as a sign between himself and Israel, and that it was a testimony that God was their God and they were his people. All right. Now, I just want to show you, we're going to look at Isaiah 56, 6 to 7 soon, and you'll see that the Gentiles would be saved, be invited into the holy mountain if they observed Shabbat and kept steadfastly to the covenant, meaning the 10 commandments, because that's the Ark of the Covenant. That's a word or expression that talks about the 2 tablets of stone, the 10 commandments inside the Ark of the Covenant. That's what Friedman says the word covenant should be understood in these type of contexts. So this is Sabbath is a sign not only to the people of Israel, it's also a sign to which Gentiles are allegiant to God Yahweh. All right. So even though the scholar I'm looking at, Dr. Eli, there, he does not make any claim of what exactly is the mark of the beast. I'm suggesting it does have a real meaning, and I believe it's the day of worshiping on the day of the sun. So I asked this question: can mark of the beast be Sunday worship of the Lord? That doesn't mean Yahweh; it means the Lord. If you were worshiping Yahweh, you say, "I'm worshiping Yahweh" on that day. All right, but that's not what people do. They say, I'm worshiping, we call it the Lord's Day, and that's not specifically talking about Yahweh. Okay, so let's take a look here about what God thinks about the day of the sun that people typically in the United States observe as their worship day. This started in 321 AD, March 7, 321 AD, and it was called Dies Solis. Solis means sun in the sky, the day of the sun, or known as Sunday. It was ordered by Constantine, a pagan ruler who pretended to be a Christian 4 years later, 3 or 4 years later, claiming that he had been a Christian since 315 AD, never told anyone about it, or anyone publicly about it. And then he basically said in 324, you're going to go to Nicaea. I'm going to tell you what you're going to do. And he did. He said, if you don't go along with me, you're going to be exiled from the kingdom. 200 people vote with him and 5 don't. Oh, what was the issue? That there's a God called God the Son, a son of a father God, and he's the creator of all things. Heaven and earth were made by him, and all things were created by him and for him. And that's what it says in the Nicene Creed, which is a creed from the Apollo religion. That's not the God of the Bible. That is the god Apollo, or Dionysius. He's also known as Dionysius in the cult of Apollo at Delphi and Philippi. That was where that came from. And we didn't know that because we're dumb Gentiles. So he ordered us to do all these things. And then when he dies, we find out all the fraud that he had been doing, that people could see with their own eyes all the time. The statues at Constantinople showed him to be the god of the sun in the center of the city of Constantinople. But people disregarded that, but when he dies, he leaves the consecration going behind. It's still at the British Museum, and it says he's Divus Constantinus, which means he's God Constantine. And on the other side, it shows he's Sol Invictus, the god of the sun. That's the Latin name. Sol Invictus, the god of Apollo, is the other name in Greek. He's the god of the sun, heading up on a chariots up to return to the sun in the sky. So he was a pretender all along, and he thought he was God. Oh, and he also, by the way, ordered his body to be put in at the temple, the basilica of the 12 apostles that he had collected, and ordered Eusebius to collect all the burial boxes for the 12 apostles and put them in a circle in a mausoleum type situation. And when he died, unbeknownst to Eusebius, the plan was, and did get executed, the military men take Constantine's body, and guess where he puts his body? Among the 12 apostles? Is it in the circle? No, he's ordered to be put in the center. Eusebius was furious, and within 2 weeks that body was gone and has never been seen again. So the most allegedly famous Christian of all time has no burial. That's how evil his act was, and Eusebius couldn't even stomach it. But I digress. So let us read the command of Constantine to stop resting on Shabbat. That's the implication of this, because there's only one group that won't follow this, and that would be the Jewish people, because they're going to rest on the Shabbat, and they're not allowed to do that anymore. It's only one day a week in Rome you could rest. It would be Sunday, the god of the sun. Let the people, Constantine's ruling say, rest on the venerable day. Venerable means worship worthy. The venerable or worship worthy day of the sun, that's the sun in the sky, a god in Constantine's mind, which ultimately we learned was himself. There was also, though, there was a special exception for permission to work in agricultural workers, okay? But otherwise, it said, let your rest be mandatory for the day of the sun. And here's the actual decree. And this is in an article on Sol Invictus at Wikipedia. So remember, we saw the beast is a sign. We saw that the mark of the beast is a sign, and we saw that Sabbath is a sign. So these are not coincidences. I think these are exactly parallel to each other. And let me show you a couple of things to think about. Sabbath and Gentiles. Number one, Jesus identifies the key salvation message in Isaiah 56 involves Sabbath for Gentiles. So if you want to be saved, God Yahweh already told you, and Jesus, well, I'm just going to leave it there. You already were told in verse 6 to 7, if you want to go to heaven, a Gentile must observe Shabbat, period. There's other things, also the covenant, the 10 commandments, in other words. You have to observe that. Doesn't mean you get to go eat shrimp and all these other things. There's blessings and cursings for violating God's other commandments, but the commandments to go to his holy mountain are clearly stated in Isaiah 56:67 by Yahweh to the prophet Isaiah. 3 chapters, I might add, after, or excuse me, yes, 3 chapters after the prophecy in Isaiah from Yahweh about the suffering servant who would be Jesus. So, and Jesus then quotes Isaiah 56 about the Gentiles will be welcome into God's holy mountain and to his house of prayer. Jesus quotes from this passage, but Paul did not seem to know anything about how to get saved for Gentiles, according to God's word to Yahweh. Number 2, his true apostles, Jesus' true apostles and brother, expect weekly Sabbath observance by Gentiles in Jerusalem at the Jerusalem conference. We'll see that in Acts 15 in a second. 3, how do we resolve Paul's teachings against Sabbath observance? So we'll look at that. Let's take a look first at Isaiah 56:6-7. And we're going to ask the question, did Christ quote from Isaiah 56, which held Gentiles must keep Sabbath for salvation? Let's read this from the King James Version. This is Yahweh speaking, verse 6. Also the sons of the stranger, that is the Gentile, that join themselves to the Lord, that is Yahweh in Hebrew, to serve him and to love the name of the Lord, to love the name of Yahweh in Hebrew, to be his servants. Every one that keeps the Sabbath from polluting it and take hold of my covenant, that is the 10 commandments, and we've explained that before. The Ark of the Covenant is the 2 tablets of stone are inside of the Ark of the Covenant, meaning the 10 commandments. And take hold of my covenant, the 10 commandments. Even them will I bring to my holy mountain. And what you need to know is that in Isaiah 11, it talks about the shoot of the house of Jesse, which means the Davidic line will have a messianic figure, and he will lead people into the new holy mountain in what the scholars who are Christians would agree is the millennial kingdom. So this is where we're hoping to all go when we die, that, when we are aware of our surroundings, we hope to be in the millennial kingdom at that point. And that's what we're counting on. And that's also called the Holy Mountain in Isaiah 11 and in Isaiah 56. The scholars all agree. And make them joyful in my house of prayer, for mine house shall be called the house of prayer for all people. The latter section is quoted by Jesus twice here in Matthew 21, verse 13, and Luke 19, verse 46. Let's read in Luke. And saying unto them, it is written, my house is the house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves. So that's what Jesus is quoting. He's anybody who didn't know that Jesus was pointing at a way of getting saved for Gentiles simply means they don't know the Bible very well, okay? And guess what? Paul did not know the Bible very well because he never cites or knows anything about this. And people say, well, let's see. What does Paul think about the message of being a person who keeps Sabbath? Paul says, don't do it. Colossians 2:16, let no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink or in respect of a holy day or of the new moon or of the Sabbath days. So you can do whatever you want. He says in Romans, be convinced as any man wants to be convinced. There's no special day that you have to worry about. And just so you know, Paul was very clear that the reason for this, for at least Jewish people, is the law no longer even exists for Jewish people. He says this very clearly in 1 Corinthians 9, verses 19 to 23. But we're just going to look here at verse 20 in particular, starting with verse 19, though. Though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. To the Jews I became, or pretended is actually a good translation there. To the Jews I pretended to be a Jew and to win the Jews. To those under the law I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. So he says, I am not myself under the law. That means Jewish people are not under the law. There's no more Jew or Gentile, he says in Romans. You can't avoid the fact he has abolished the law for everybody. And you can also learn in Colossians 2 verses 14-15, Paul begins saying, Jesus came blotting out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, which was contrary to us, and took it out of the way, nailing it to the cross. Very clear that he's an apostate. He's telling you a law that is eternal for all generations is gone, and which Isaiah said the only way to get into heaven is you got to keep Sabbath. And that's not going away. That's eternal for all generations, my friends. And Paul goes on in Colossians 2:16-17, let no man therefore judge you in meat or drink or inspect the holy day or of the new moon or the Sabbath days, which are a shadow of things to come, but the body is of Christ. A shadow means the minute the light comes, the light of Christ comes into your life, the shadows, everything in the shadows just disappear. You don't see them anymore. They're they're in darkness, and once the light comes, they're gone. You can't see them anymore. But did Paul abolish the Sabbath? Was this what attracted Constantine to Christianity in the first place? Yes, that's one of the things he could use. Paul was a very venomous, in fact, very deliberate about destroying Sabbath. Look at this. You have a good Christian website, meaning, I mean, these people love Christ, I believe, and they relish in the idea that Sabbath keepers are refuted. So they're refuting people who keep Sabbath as if they're doing the wrong thing, right? And except these people are now not going to heaven because they should have been aware of Isaiah 56 by now, you would think. But now you are, and so you're accountable to what I just read you, Isaiah 56. Whoever's accountable is going to be judged by that. But I really think if they're going to refute Sabbath keeping, they should have studied the word Sabbath throughout the entire Bible, and they should have found it. So there should be accountable, but that's between them and God. But this is what they say. Colossians 2:14 verses 16 says the 10 commandments are abolished. Thank you for saying it so clearly. They don't realize what they're saying is Paul is an apostate and must be executed on Deuteronomy 13:1-10. That's God's commands. Why didn't Paul get executed? Oh, because he was a Roman citizen and the people of Jerusalem don't have the power to execute him. But that's what should have happened because he was a complete apostate against God's law. I just want to add here, Professor Eisman describes Paul's words at numerous points in Galatians as that which, quote, an objective observer might be forgiven for thinking this man is not only unbalanced, but actually mad. Yes, these ideas that you can just throw away God's law like that, like it's like you're making yourself a demigod. It's just like impossible. The law is eternal for all generations. 27 times it says that. How can it go away? Jesus says it's not going away. The heavens and earth won't pass away. The law will not go away before the heavens and earth pass away, is how he put it. All right, so let's return to the topic. All right, so because we learned in Exodus 31, verses 12-18, that the Sabbath, keeping the Sabbath, was a sign of where your allegiance rests and what your laws that you are following are coming out of the Ten Commandments. The Sabbath command is one of the Ten Commandments, right? So that is important. And then when you go back to the mark of the beast, you see it's the same idea that you have to be keeping the Sabbath command as a sign between you and God. Okay, you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. Deuteronomy 6, verse 8. So if that's a sign, and keeping Sabbath is a sign, what would be the clear disproof, or excuse me, what would be the proof that you're following the beast system and not the law? Well, it's very hard to prove you're keeping the Ten Commandments just by simply, looking at you. But I can tell if I observe you long enough whether you observe Shabbat or not, and that's going to tell me you keep a sign that identifies you with God's law. If you don't keep the Shabbat and you keep the day of the sun or some other day, or don't keep the Shabbat at all, you are part of the beast system. And so that's probably what Revelation is predicting. And if you also study the book of Revelation, is talking about a hill, a city sit on a hill with 7 hills. It's obviously Rome. So Rome is the creator of this beast system where you would actually no longer observe the Shabbat. You would observe the day of the sun. And that's when the day of the sun was first created. There was no day of the sun until 321 AD when Constantine created this day in the first place and then made it the only rest day of the week that's permissible. Okay, so I hope that gives you a little background about a possibility of what the Mark of the Beast really represents. It's Sunday day worship. And the only right day to observe God's rest and worship is, I should say, be clear, God's rest that he requires, and he does ask for a convocation, and that's mentioned one of the 7 times the command for Shabbat is mentioned, that there was a convocation. So that's suggested clearly by that reference. And therefore, that's the day to mark and show as a sign that you're a follower of Yahweh. Okay? And Yeshua is his son. All right. God bless. I hope that helps everybody in interpreting the Bible better. And God bless and take care. Ciao. Bye.